Are you ready for the next lecture for our class? Today's topic, the presidency. This topic will be approached in this way. First, I'll address the presidency and the Constitution and address things like qualifications, the line of succession in case the president was to die. But the core will address the roles or functions that the president fulfills, beginning with the administrative function, domestic policy, foreign policy, the military role, and symbolic. The White House clearly is a symbol of America's presidency, and this is where the president does an awful lot of work. The other side of the White House shows the residence. I was lucky enough a few years back to travel to the White House and to even get a tour. Notice I'm wearing the team colors. This is my family from a few years ago, and we also had our exchange student from Germany. We'll begin by looking at some past presidents and seeing who historians and political scientists argued were the best and the worst presidents in American history. C-SPAN has undertaken an extensive study of the presidency, and whenever one of these studies has been done, the top three has always been the same. In the latest poll that was done in 2017 of experts, Franklin Roosevelt came out as number 3, George Washington came out as number 2, and the best president in American history was Abraham Lincoln. The evaluation of the presidents continued. This was through the Obama administration. Now, many people would argue that Richard Nixon had a failed presidency, but he also had several successes, so he ranks number 28 on the list. Who's the worst president of all time? Well, James Buchanan. He was president on the eve of the Civil War and was unable to breach any kind of a compromise between the North and the South. He was seen as inept.
Remember that survey that you took at the beginning of the semester? One of the questions is shown here. And by the way, at that time, Joe Biden was in the White House. So do you approve or disapprove of the way Joe Biden was handling his job in general? Only 7% thought that he should receive a positive approval rating. That's not very high. I've actually been teaching at West Shore for a while, so I have data going back to the fall of 1998. And you can see here the different approval ratings, like an average or a smattering of the different approval ratings going back to Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, President Trump, as well as Joe Biden. So in the future, I will be adding to this list. But you see that often presidents do not have a very high approval rating among students here at West Shore Community College.
Next, we'll explore some of the qualifications in order to serve as President of the United States, as outlined in the Constitution. The Constitution outlines a few qualifications. The first, as shown here, deals with age. One must be at least 35 years old. Also, you have to be a citizen, a natural-born citizen, so a citizen from birth. The easiest way to achieve this is to be born in the United States. There's also a residency requirement. One has to be a resident of the United States for 14 consecutive years prior to running for president. That way, if somebody lived outside the country, it's okay, but you have to reestablish your residency for a minimum of 14 years before you would be eligible to run. The salary of the president? Well, it's $400,000.
Now, I don't know about you, but $400,000 is a lot of money. It's a heck of a lot more money than I'm ever going to make as a community college professor. However, let's do a quick comparison. Let's look at the entertainment industry, and particularly actors and actresses. Hey, Barbie did really well at the box office last year. So Margot Robbie, she was the highest paid actress in Hollywood, and she earned $59 million. As far as actors go, well, Adam Sandler has made a heck of a lot of movies lately, and he made $73 million. Now, just to let you know, a year ago, Taylor Swift, not an actress, but an entertainer, she made over $90 million. Well, athletes often sign contracts for big dollars. Cristiano Ronaldo, the soccer player, well, he earned $46 million in salary, but his endorsements added an additional 90 million. Well, how about business? Well, Steven Schwartzman is the CEO of the private equity firm Blackstone. His salary, $253 million. So, $400,000 is a heck of a lot of money. However, I think these figures help to show Americans value entertainment and things like that. Uh, $400,000 for the leader of the free world? Well, private business gets you a heck of a lot more money.
One thing I like to study would be presidential succession, particularly if the president was to die while in office. Are you familiar with the first president to die in office? Well, he's shown here. His name was William Henry Harrison. Let me tell you a story about William Henry Harrison. He was a military hero who had defeated Native Americans at a battle called Tippecanoe. He was first elected to the White House in 1840. But then he didn't listen to his mother. It was very cold when he was inaugurated in 1841, and he delivered the longest inaugural address in American history, and he didn't wear a hat, and he didn't wear gloves. He caught a cold, it turned into pneumonia, and he died about 1 month into his administration. Supposedly, Harrison died because Native Americans had placed a curse on the White House. Any president elected in a year ending with a zero was supposed to have died while in office, and Harrison started this when he was elected in 1840. Well, let's see how this turned out. Harrison was the first, and he died only 30 days into his administration. He was elected in 1840. 1860, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. In 1880, James Garfield was assassinated. In 1900, William McKinley was assassinated. In 1920, Warren Harding suffered a heart attack and died. And then in 1940, Franklin Roosevelt had a brain aneurysm and died. The curse continued until 1960. In 60, John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And then in 1980, Ronald Reagan was shot a couple of months into his presidency in March of 1981. His would-be assassin was John Hinckley Jr., who was soon arrested. This ended the so-called curse on the presidency. Now, if the president was to die, I think most people know that the vice president would take over. But do you know the next two positions in the line of succession? Well, the next person would be the Speaker of the House. And after that, it would be the President pro tempore of the Senate, which is a position that most Americans have never even heard of. The line of succession continues much further, and it's set by federal law. You don't need to know these for a test, but they begin with the Secretary of State, then Treasury, Secretary of Defense, and Attorney General. The line of succession continues on to these additional cabinet-level positions. If something catastrophic was to happen, it might go all the way to the Secretary of Homeland Security. An amendment to the Constitution also helps us determine how to fill a vacancy in the vice presidency. If the VP was to die or to resign, the president has the authority to nominate a new candidate. However, that candidate must be confirmed by a majority vote in both the House and the Senate. The core of the lecture is next. We'll explore the 5 major roles or functions that the president fulfills. We'll begin with the administrative function. This role or function is often overlooked by many. Under the administrative function, the president has the ability to either appoint or to nominate maybe as many as 3,000 to 4,000 people to a range of administrative positions. There are several examples. One would be ambassadors to other nations.
Ambassadors serve as the eyes and the ears for each president as they're serving in different countries. They can even serve as a spokesperson for the administration. The images here show Pete Hoekstra. He was the ambassador to the Netherlands in the first Trump administration. He was actually born in the Netherlands, came over to the United States as a boy, and then moved to Holland, Michigan. Later, he served as a congressman from West Michigan, so it was interesting that he would serve as the ambassador to the Netherlands. Recently, he's been named the U.S. ambassador to Canada for the second Trump administration. So, go figure, he's had quite a career in public service.
There are many other examples of people who work in the presidential administration. Maybe the most important group would be the so-called cabinet level officers. This is the most important set of advisors and policymakers for the president. They help the president enforce all laws.
The image here shows Jennifer Granholm. During the Biden administration, she served as the Secretary of Energy. I mention her because she is the former two-term governor of Michigan. So here's another example of a figure from Michigan serving as a cabinet member in an administration.
Congress passes laws, but the executive branch enforces them. Executive orders outline the steps necessary that the administration takes when it comes to enforcing those laws. They actually have the legal force or the authority of a law, and they can require agencies to enforce the laws in very specific manners. However, they cannot violate the law, and they cannot violate the Constitution. Here we see President Trump and President Obama, each of whom have issued several executive orders during their administrations. It's nothing new to issue an executive order. Here's one. When Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, that was an executive order. Executive orders have become controversial in the last several years, but there's one other caveat I'd like to mention. If one president issues an executive order, it's not binding for future administrations.
In case you're interested, here's some statistics dealing with presidents and executive orders. No worries, you don't need to memorize this, but I just thought that you would find this interesting. So if we look at George Washington, he only issued 8 total executive orders, or an average of 1 per year. Jump ahead to Franklin Roosevelt, where he issued over 3,000 and averaged about 300 per year. If you look at the last few administrations, they're still issuing a number of executive orders each year. However, they're not nearly as many as Franklin Roosevelt. So with George W. Bush, it was 36 a year. Obama was about the same at 35. Donald Trump in his first term was at 55. And Joe Biden averaged 41. We're so early in the second Trump administration that it's a little difficult to try to identify an average, but he's issued 73 as of February of 2025.
I will place a hyperlink on Canvas to a clip that Saturday Night Live did in 2014 after President Obama issued an executive order dealing with immigration. It's actually pretty funny. So you may or may not want to watch this after the lecture is over with. The next roller function deals with domestic policy. One way the president shapes domestic policy is through the budget. The president is actually required to submit to Congress a proposed budget each year. Now, the president can propose a budget, but unless Congress passes it, it's not binding. What's important about this, though, is that it outlines the goals that the president has and the top priorities. So you could see an example here of President Trump's 2020 budget. The areas in blue show areas where he wants to increase funding. The areas in yellow show regions where he wants to cut funding. Presidents often have proposals for legislation. For President Trump, it was a tax cut. For President Obama, it was a national health care plan. But the president cannot go to Congress and introduce the legislation. Someone in Congress has to sponsor it. Here's a statistic. About half of all laws originated in some way from the president. Now, this is a little bit of a review, but what I wanted to address was the president's role with lawmaking. Once Congress passes a bill, there are three things the president can do. First, sign the bill, and boom, it becomes law. If the president's opposed, he could veto the bill, but that veto could be overridden by Congress. If the president does nothing, well, if the president does nothing and 10 working days pass, that bill becomes a law even without the president's signature. But if Congress quits for the year or adjourns within 10 working days, it becomes a pocket veto. For those of you who are wondering, if the president issues a pocket veto, it cannot be overridden by Congress. It's one way the president can really shape lawmaking. So how have different presidents acted when it comes to vetoes, veto overrides, pocket vetoes, things like that? Here are some statistics. No worries, you're not going to be tested on this, but we see some early presidents not using it very much. Although Andrew Jackson issued 12 vetoes, more than the previous 6 presidents combined. Franklin Roosevelt set the record for the most vetoes. Holy cow. He had a huge impact on all legislation.
Now, here you see some statistics dealing with some recent presidential administrations. You'll notice that with the Bush, Obama, first Trump, and Biden administrations, they did not issue very many vetoes. President Trump has yet to issue a veto in his term, but he's only been in office for a short time.
The next role or function is foreign policy. Probably the area where presidents have the most leeway or power would deal with American foreign policy. Let's start with a concept. Presidents provide the overall vision for American foreign policy.
The images here help to identify some of the main goals recent presidents have had with their foreign policy. In the upper left, we see President Obama thought it was important for U.S. to normalize relations with Cuba. On the bottom left, we see President Trump had as a focal point of his administration, America first. Joe Biden has only been in office a short time. However, his focus was on American leadership and diplomacy worldwide.
The reason why presidents have so much authority is that the president is the person who negotiates all treaties. However, there is a check on the president's ability to do so. In order for a treaty to become a binding agreement, a 2/3 majority vote in support of that proposal is needed in the Senate. However, there's something similar to an executive order that ensures that the president would have control over foreign policy. That is an executive agreement. It's an agreement between the American president and the leader of another country. However, this does not require Senate approval. But again, there's a check on this. It's not binding for future presidential administrations. Here we see a chart that identifies the number of executive agreements as compared to treaties. Notice the arrow is pointing to the Roosevelt administration. As the United States became a world power during World War II in the 20th century, we see the number of executive agreements increasing. Another important role that the president fulfills would be as the military leader of the country. Article 2 of the Constitution outlines the powers of the president, and it declares that the president is, quote, Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and the militia of the several states. President is Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. Because the president serves as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, many have argued that a president should have a military background. Can you identify these military leaders who've been president? We've got George Washington, Andrew Jackson, Dwight Eisenhower, and George H.W. Bush. While the president is Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, there is a check on the president's ability to wage war. Only Congress has the authority to declare war. In the past, there's been conflict between presidents who've wanted to go to war and Congress who has not declared war. And so in the 1970s, the War Powers Act was passed in order to try to address and outline times when the president could send troops into combat. There are three. First, if Congress declares war. Also, if there's a crisis, the president may act alone for a limited amount of time. And then Congress might specifically give the president the authority to send troops into combat given a particular situation. Now, there's no need to copy down this whole slide, but one time recently, when Congress did give the president the authority to send troops into combat, yet they didn't declare war, was in the aftermath of the attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon in September of 2001. This is the joint resolution authorizing President Bush to send troops into combat. It passed overwhelmingly in the Senate and the House. The last role or function to be discussed would be the symbolic role the president plays as the leader of the country. The president is our top political leader, but the president also serves as a head of state. In many ways, this is kind of similar to a symbolic monarch. Like in Great Britain, the Queen doesn't have much power. However, she is the symbolic leader of her country. As the symbolic leader of the country, the president might host a state dinner, as you see here with President Obama. Or on the right, we see President Bush throwing out the first pitch to start the World Series. These really don't have much power associated with them, but they show that the president is the symbolic leader of our nation. President Trump has used new technologies to expand the symbolic role of the president. Here we see the president congratulating the country on the 4th of July holiday. He also is congratulating the winners of the World Series and also has a Thanksgiving Day message to the nation. Some of the president's tweets have been more controversial, criticizing political opponents, possibly insulting foreign heads of state. These have prompted other Republicans even to argue, and this is a quote from Bob Corker, that the White House is an adult daycare. Both Democratic as well as Republican presidents have tarnished the symbolic role of the president in a range of manners. Here we see some sex scandals being highlighted that involve Bill Clinton as well as Donald Trump. There is one actual power that the president has that's associated with the symbolic role. The president can pardon anyone who's been convicted of a federal crime. A selection from the Constitution is shown here.
Now, there are very few limits to the pardon power that the president has. On the left, we see a critical article dealing with President Biden as he issued several pardons to people in his final days in office, including one to his own son who had been convicted of a range of crimes. He also issued several preemptive pardons to people that he believed would come under attack from the incoming Trump administration. On the right, we see some images associated with some of the pardons President Trump issued in his first day in office in 2025. He issued a blanket pardon to the individuals who were involved in the insurrection that took place January 6th, 2021.
We're just about done. We've got a few concluding comments next. This presentation has addressed a few areas. It involved the different evaluation or rankings of different administrations and how the Constitution has addressed the presidency. But the core has addressed the 5 major roles or functions that the president fulfills. You should be able to describe and then evaluate these 5 roles or functions, and then determine which you believe to be the most important. Well, this is all for lecture number 11. The presidency. Only one more left.